Cassian gives us a fascinating download on the Bone Carver and old gods. First, he warns Farra that she should focus on finding a way to control the Bone Carver in this world. Italics on the this world. If they help him open up the tear to his own world so he can return, they may be fighting far worse enemies than the King of Hybern. Basically, they could invite otherworldly monsters to Prythian and then they'd really be dead. This is so delicious thinking of the bigger Maasverse. Second, Cassian explains that way more than 15,000 years ago, there was life here at the prison before the High Lords took Prythian. The old gods ruled this land and the ancient Fae worshipped them. Then the magic shifted to the High Fae, who brought the cauldron and mother deities. Over time, most people forgot about worshiping these old gods as they adopted these other deities. This leaves us with some inconsistencies because the Bone Carver did say in ACOTAR'S, quote, long ago, before the High Fae, before man, there was a cauldron. They say all the magic was contained inside it, that the world was born in it. But Cassian says here, as they're walking to the prison, quote, there was life here before the High Lords took Prythian. Old gods, we call them. They ruled the forests and the rivers and the mountains. Some were those things. Then the magic shifted to the High Fae, who brought the cauldron and mother along with them. And though the old gods were still worshipped by a select few, most people forgot them. So that leaves us with the question of what came first, this world where the old gods lived and the ancient Fae who worshipped them, or the cauldron which created the world and we know for a fact that the world is bound to it. Is there possibly a way that both of these could exist? I'm personally going to chalk this inconsistency up to history being different depending on who tells it. Origin legends are passed down among the generations and are going to differ, going to have gaps that we simply just don't know. At least that's what I'm telling myself as I follow down the ACOTAR rabbit hole because these inconsistencies can drive me crazy, but really does make sense with, history and the generations and who's telling it. Anyway, I'm wondering how or if the old gods are connected to the Dagin. Like they're not as powerful, but they are of the same essence as the Dagin. They are all from another realm or other realms plural and are extremely powerful. Rees will tell us that the Dagin were the first masters of this world. An old legend says that they were near gods and monsters who created the Fae and humans. That's not entirely true, as we will learn, but I'm not going to get into Maasverse spoilers territory with that. Dagin drank magic like fine wine. It was their source of food, essentially. So this could equate to them feeding off life sources like these death gods. The Dagin were defeated by Fionn and his cauldron-made great sword Gwydion, but then he was betrayed by his queen. And it's possible that this ancient Fae female warrior who contained the Bone Carver's siblings is Fionn's queen who helped him defeat the Dagin. Lanthus might also be considered a death god because he supposedly cannot be killed like Koschei, who is the master of his own death. And we know Lanthus participated in the wild hunt, which the Dagin would, quote, gather a host of their fiercest, most merciless warriors and grant them free reign to kill as they pleased. And Lanthus says, quote, Fae and beast bowed before us. So maybe Lanthus and these death gods weren't the almighty Dagin, but there are heavy connections that make them like the Dagin's minions, or they are their fiercest, most merciless warriors. So I know that's a whole lot, but it's so fascinating to think about all of those connections.
I've completely forgotten about the wild hunt part of this story. Like, that was just such a small little insert in Silver Flames that it's like, whenever I think of the wild hunt, my mind immediately goes to The Witcher. But I do want to build off of this for a second, because I love the idea that the Bone Carver, his siblings, are Dagin, or I'm going to say like Dagin step downs, basically. Yeah. But also, I wonder, the Bone Carver specifically, if he's, I'm going to call it a good Dagin, because back in ACOTAR'S, he explains how the cauldron fell into terrible hands, aka the Dagin. And when Rees asks where they hid the cauldron, the Bone Carver says, quote, tell me one of your secrets and I'll tell you mine. Meaning that he was probably one of, if not the only person who hid the cauldron away. So did he betray his fellow Dagin, or again, Dagin adjacent, and hid the cauldron away for them, making it possible for Fionn and his Fae warrior to contain said Dagin? That's unfortunately all I can say right now that we're not in Maasverse Madness this episode.
Knowing how early the Bone Carver went into the prison, I don't know. I think that's a fun theory.
Keep going.
It's been a while since I said that.
I know, it really has. I missed it.
Let's get back to Cassian's download about the Bone Carver specifically, because legend says that he is one of these old gods and that he is able to annihilate hundreds of soldiers with one breath, which may be useful, say, on a battlefield. Hence why Farra and Cassian are going to meet the Bone Carver right now. They know they don't have the numbers to defeat Hybern, but if they can get the monsters to fight on their side, they'll stand more of a chance because of how deadly the Bone Carver is. But they will need to ensure he is bound to obey them within an inch of his life, which would happen through a bargain bond, so he isn't unleashed upon the whole world and cause all-out destruction and death. Just to their enemies, you hear, Bone Carver? In this moment, Cassian states that no one knows how he ended up in the prison. But luckily, the Bone Carver will tell us soon enough, or at least give us a high-level version of it. They don't know how they'll free him from the prison yet, because once an inmate is in prison there is no way for them to ever get out. But luckily, our crew knows the one person who has escaped, which we will get into when she shares that later in this episode. Today's serial topic is the Old Gods. The Old Gods are deities who ruled before Prythian became a kingdom. This is all long ago, far more than 15,000 years ago, in times before the Mother and the Cauldron and Prythian. Like I mentioned earlier in the episode, we do get that inconsistent history lessons about the early days of this world, and quite frankly, I have tried so hard to make sense of it and find the answer, but the more I look, the more conflicting histories I uncover, so we're just going to move on. The Old Gods are also known as death gods because they can feed on life itself thanks to the magnitude of their powers. They achieve this in various ways, but on a grand level, like say on a battlefield, they literally suck the life force out of their enemies, turning them into mummified husks. And they are true immortals. The Fae have very long lives, but these gods are actually immortal from other dimensions. But they can still be killed from powerful forces like the Cauldron, or Cauldron-made weapons, or apparently their neck getting snapped by the King of Hybern, which I have some questions about. But anyway, as I'm talking about these old gods / death gods, I will specifically be referring to three who we learn the most about. However, it is my understanding that there were more old gods than these three, like Lanthus, for instance. They originated from a different dimension and fell into this world. The ancient Fae worshipped these old gods, mainly because they feared them. Two of these old gods, Koschei and Stryga, loved the attention and basked in the Fae's devotion, but their brother, the Bone Carver, did not enjoy this attention so much. Speaking of Koschei, Stryga, and the Bone Carver, let's talk more about these specific old gods. They are extremely powerful siblings whose origins are steeped in legend even among the Fae. They cross the dimensions of another world, falling into this one of their own free will. Because of how powerful they were by this world's standards, I just love that little note showing how vast this universe is. They were identified as gods by the ancient Fae and worshipped by them until the Bone Carver hid from his siblings in the territory that would become the prison, and an ancient Fae female trapped Koschei and Stryga in confined spaces in the world. They may be contained and diminished, but their influence and power in this world remains considerable. Okay, now time to summarize each of these three death god siblings. First, we have Koschei. He is the oldest brother of the three siblings. An ancient female Fae warrior confined and bound Koschei in a lake on the continent. Nowadays, he's regarded as a powerful sorcerer who likes to imprison women, like Vassa, the sixth queen. He is the sorcerer that the mortal queens gave Vassa to because she disagreed with them about allying with Hybern. He cursed Vassa, so she is currently bound to his lake and turns into a firebird by day and a woman by night. To give you an idea of how powerful he is, the spell he cast on Vassa is woven into her very blood, and not even Helion Spellcleaver has a chance of breaking it. Then we have Stryga, better known as the Weaver. She is the Bone Carver's twin and younger sister to Koschei. Like I mentioned, she reveled in the Fae worshipping her as a god and used the deaths of the others to keep her body young by feasting on their life forces. It's not outright said, but I think we can imply this means there were living sacrifices to her. The Weaver, or Stryga, being young and beautiful and just basking in it, loved her mirrors. She had a black castle, and one of her favorite mirrors was the Ouroboros. Before imprisoning Koschei, this female Fae warrior put an end to Stryga's reign of terror. She tricked Stryga into diminishing her power and becoming confined to the middle, where she is now bound to a small cottage in the middle of an ancient forest. She is at the top of the food chain in the middle. From then on, Stryga became known as the Weaver in the Wood, and she is unable to leave her bit of land of her own free will, imprisoned with only herself for company. High Lords are not allowed to interfere with her, and they do not try to retrieve their treasures that she hoards thanks to the laws that protect her and her wrath. How do the High Lord's treasures find their way to our cottage in the first place? I genuinely don't know, except for Reese's mom, who willingly gave her the future wedding ring as a test for her son's future mate. But I think that's an exception to the rule. Bottom line, her cottage is described as a junk shop of some immortal hoarder. Because she cannot feast on life the way she used to, she is now both young looking in her body, and yet her face is hollowed out, shriveled up from the lack of enough feeding on life. She is now blind and, like the Bone Carver, senses that Farra is made differently, like all but unlike all. As her way of continuing to feed off life forces, she weaves life into fabric. Using soft yarn that was somehow previously a life force, she weaves on her loom people's life forces. I don't have any idea how that works, but she does make it happen. And of course, there's the Bone Carver. The Bone Carver was the least magically powerful of the three siblings, and he feared them. Driven by this fear of his siblings, he took it upon himself to be put in the prison before his siblings were contained, so he could hide from them. Well, technically, when he went to the prison, it wasn't the prison as we know it yet, so either we have an inconsistency in the timeline, or he went to the territory that would become the prison. He is particularly interested in death. His fascination with death further alludes to him being a death god, even if he doesn't personally consider himself one. He appears differently to each person he meets, apparently however he chooses to appear, but I do believe it's connected to death in some way or another. That is not confirmed though, that is only a theory. He carves the door of every inmate in the prison. He seems to have the foresight of the future, carving deaths into the bones brought by others in exchange for the knowledge he possesses. And that, friends, is our serial tea time on the old gods.
You know what I just realized is the Bone Carver in ACOTAR'S says about like the bone that he gets from the Midgard worm. He says like, I will carve your death in here, Farra. She died in Silver Flames, giving birth to Nyx, the boy he looks like.
Yes. Yes.
Is that really obvious? And I'm just
No, it's not, because that is really consistent evidence to him appearing as someone associated with your death.
Yeah.
However, why did Reese see Jurian?
I don't know. Maybe because Jurian was resurrected by the cauldron and made and unmade, Reese gives his life to give back into the cauldron. That's a stretch, though, I think.
Yes, but at least it's some kind of possibility. Good thinking.
I like it.
Today, we are rolling up our sleeves and talking about the entire Maasverse. So please only continue listening if you've read all of Throne of Glass and the Crescent City series. All right, let's continue our discussion about the old gods. Are the old gods connected to the Dagin, who we know are the Asteri and maybe the Volg? I know that's a little bit questionable there. The Dagin would drink magic like fine wine, like I mentioned earlier, and the Asteri require first light during the drop. So that would equate to them feeding off life forces like these death gods.
There's also the Asteri having the second light from people who are in the bone quarter and like move on, basically. So they have first light and second light.
And that could equate to them feeding off life forces in a similar fashion as these death gods. There are also different levels of Volg. So I wonder if the Asteri are, I'll call it the most powerful Volg, or an evolved version of the Volg, and the old gods are more like their minions, kind of like the lesser levels of the Volg there. I don't know if that makes any sense, but...
No, it does. It does. And I love the idea of them, the Asteri and the Dagin, being evolved versions of the Volg, which we'll get into the supporting evidence for that in a second. But when you say like the old gods are almost like their minions, I imagine them, the old gods, being much more powerful than like a Volg prince, for instance, yes, assuming that they are Volg or even Volg adjacent. I will say this, it is very sus because Koschei has a black box that is like super precious, like my precious to him. Is this some kind of Volg black ring, black collar situation, but just in box form that he has? Potentially.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into some of our supporting evidence about how the old gods are connected to the Dagin and the Asteri and possibly the Volg. Lanthus and the Weaver bleed black blood. There. The Volg and the Asteri have black blood too. Remember that the one Asteri who is killed in the prison, she bleeds black blood. So the fact that Lanthus and the Weaver also do, I feel like that means that it's a dead giveaway that they are all connected.
Which, side note, I thought of this earlier and I couldn't say it. When Nesta kills Vesperus in the prison in Crescent City 3, we mentioned earlier how Nesta is almost like a amalgamation of Gwydion, like a Gwydion-esque sword, like the power of the cauldron and the power of an old god. She puts her power into Ataraxia, which then kills Vesperus. So there's another instance of Nesta having the power of the cauldron to be able to kill the Asteri, Dagin, / maybe Volg.
Yes, because she is almost like the bridge between the cauldron and creating these weapons, because she has that same cauldron power essence that then she transmits into these made objects. Exactly. Another point, again, talking about Lanthus, is that he looks a lot like Erewhon when he was conjured in a human form. Not saying they're the same individual whatsoever, but I gotta love these similar appearances that they can form into.
We should note, not when he was Parrington, but when he's like Erewhon 2.0.
Yes, exactly.
Definitely
like the blonde man. Exactly, yes. And another point, the Bone Carver wants the Ouroboros mirror, and that had belonged to his sister, the Weaver. Maeve told Aelin that her kind had taught witches to use mirrors. So there's another possible connection.
Well, and I 100% believe that the Ouroboros is some kind of witch mirror. From the Tog Wiki, quote, "Witch mirrors are mirrors with immense power that have various uses depending on the type of mirror in question." Sounds about right. Now, there is that moment where the Bone Carver is like, my sister was once a queen. Could he be referring to a Volg queen? Right?
Ah.
Now, would that be Maeve or someone else? I don't think
it's the exact same characters. I think that as we talk about the multiverse, there aren't so many of the exact same characters as the same types of characters and such.
Yes, agreed.
Let's continue another discussion about who the ancient Fae female warrior is. The Bone Carver describes her as, quote, "Clever, that Fae warrior. Her bloodline is long gone now, though a trace still runs through some human line. No one remembers her name, but I do. She would have been my salvation had I not made my choice long before she walked this earth." So we already speculated in today's ACOTAR coverage who this warrior was, but I'm going to build on it being Thea, who is Fion's queen. Her name is never said in ACOTAR, so here we are saying it here. It's Thea. She was one of the High Fae who defeated the Dagin. Now, I will say part of the Bone Carver's description doesn't fit for her because he says no one remembers her and her bloodline definitely continues through the High Lord of the Night Court.
I do wonder if he's referring to how the bloodline maybe at one point split, and he's referring to the split half of the bloodline that went to the human side. So if at one point it did split and go to the human side, I do have something to build off of that, though, is because in Celine's download, she mentions Thea, quote, "being blessed by the gods themselves." If I texted this to you and I was like, holy shit, like I freaked out. If the bloodline is like, let's say, for instance, through the Archerons, this would be a huge clue to their power boosters, that I'll say. But also this means that Rees, as a descendant of Thea, who was blessed by the gods themselves, would also, you know, explain why he is super powerful. I'm just saying, coincidence? I don't think so. Yes, I do think that with this meaning all of them stem from Thea, that does mean that Rees and Farra are distantly related. If Rowan and Aelin can do it, so can fucking Rees and Farra. I don't, like, it's distant enough. It's fine.
Well, and according to the timeline we have, it couldn't be Celine either, although she was the one who rounded up the Daglins' pets and trapped them in the prison. Technically, Amren went to the prison before it was actually a prison, since she went in before High King Fion's reign when the Dust Court flourished, which is what the prison used to be. And we know that the Bone Carver went into the prison before Amren. So technically, the Bone Carver and Amren were in the prison, not yet a prison, before Fion was defeated, before Thea took her people to Midgard, and before Celine came back to a Prythian with High Lords, and she proceeded to trap the monsters and create the prison.
We need a timeline, a visual timeline. I feel like this is crazy.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that there are inconsistencies in the timeline. Like, I would love to create one, but I think I would actually go crazy because there are these inconsistencies here. Anyway, okay, there's also speculation that this ancient Fae female warrior was Aelin.
Which I love this theory. However, I don't think they're talking about Aelin because they mention how she was on this world. So I definitely do think they're talking about Thea. Now, he is saying that the ancient female warrior's bloodline is running through a human line, while not technically human, he could be referring to Lydia in Midgard. And Aylin's bloodline is running through her, but she's technically a shifter. So I don't know if that might be a bit of a stretch. Another Crescent City option for this human bloodline, though, is actually, if this is not the Archeron, this is my number 2 theory. If the human bloodline
I do think that it is Archeron, and I don't think it is somebody that we actually know, but come on, we got to theorize.
Oh, you don't think it's someone we actually? I think it's Thea, and then the Archerons.
Oh, but how nobody remembers her bloodline.
He said how nobody remembers her bloodline, but I do.
Correct. And Thea's bloodline goes through the High Lords.
But I think he's referring to the split bloodline where it splits into the humans.
Okay, that's actually a really good point.
Now, here's just to throw a new wrench in it, like taking the Archerons completely off the board. Could he be referring to Bryce's mother's human bloodline, the Quinlan bloodline? Since we know that Rune got his starborn Fayness from his mother, not the Autumn King, that would have to mean that Bryce got starborn powers through Ember. If Thea is indeed this Fey warrior, that would mean that the Quinlan bloodline could be the distant Fae,
yes,
running through it.
Yes.
Or hell, it could be both, which means that it would be Feyre, Archeron, Elaine, Nesta, and Bryce all being distantly related to the Starborn Fae bloodline.
Which would make total sense because of the 8-pointed star. Oh my God, yes, I have chills. I think we just figured it out. Like, okay, that's canon to me now. Yep. Yep.
All right, let's go into the Bone Carver, because there's many a theory wondering if he is not Nyx, who this Bone Carver could possibly be, with the crushing blue eyes and the raven black hair. And there are people wondering if this could be Rune or Dorian. I'm going to talk about Rune because that seems to be the more popular one, especially since Bryce mentions at the end of Crescent City 2 how when Reese walks in, she's like, oh my God, it's Rune. And then she realizes it's not Rune. I love this idea. I think it would be so cool if we've actually been seeing Rune this entire time. However, Feyre sees her own mouth, or her father's mouth, in the boy. So unless there's like a wild plot twist where Feyre is like, where time is being warped and Rune is actually Feyre and Reese's son, I think we can confidently say that it is not Rune. Please do not make it Rune. That would hurt my head so badly. I love it. I love the idea. But if Feyre and Reese are actually Rune's parents, that would be wild, considering Rune's like 84. Anyway, so if we're looking at the Bone Carver as a whole, I want to back up a little bit, because Sarah Kane Reeds has an incredible video on TikTok, and we'll link it in the show notes. This theory was brought about because the Bone Carver has some different motives than his 2 out for blood siblings. In Sarah's video, she notes how with each interaction with him, our crew has to offer up a bone, and then they get to ask him all the questions they want, except for sometimes. But there is one rule: never lie to the Bone Carver. In each interaction, they will share basically a truth for a truth, unless you're Feyre and Reese and Akamath and you're still owed 2 more truths. It's fine. I'm clearly over it. What if the Bone Carver is actually a god of truth, aka the Sin Eater from Throne of Glass? As Sarah Kane Reeds points out on TikTok, in Queen of Shadows, the Sin Eater's temple is filled with bones of confessions written on them. We know that the Sin Eater was a godlike being. So is this the Bone Carver, or are they similar in some way? Again, not saying that they're the same person, but they're almost adjacent titles. But Sarah adds to this theory, because the Bone Carver explains that his home world is no more than a dust drifting across a plain. Then he draws 3 interlocking circles in the dirt. And if you're like, that sounds familiar, it's because it is the same design as the Archesian amulet that Bryce gets from Jessica. So in House of Sky and Breath, Apollyon, aka the Prince of the Pit, takes Bryce in a dream to a, quote, vast dusty plain, which is exactly how the Bone Carver describes his home world. But Apollyon takes her to not what he calls the home world, he calls it Parthos, or at least what remains of Parthos, which, yes, that is where Jessica took all of the books from before it fell, which in Parthos, the Archesian amulets, those 3 interlocking circles, are what the priestesses wore. It is described exactly the same as how the Bone Carver draws on the floor. So is the Bone Carver's homeworld Parthos? Now, I do want to point out that if this ancient Fey warrior's bloodline is indeed the Quinlan bloodline, the Bone Carver is literally drawing Bryce's necklace as he talks about this Fey warrior's bloodline running through humans. So this could be a massive hint towards it being Bryce.
Wow. I can't keep all this stuff straight. Wow.
When I tell you I had 16 books opened up on my laptop last night, this is why. Now, we do know for a fact that this is not the same thing as the Eye of Elena. There's very similar descriptions, but it is different because the Eye of Elena is described as 2 circles within a bigger circle, whereas these are 3 intertwined separate circles, almost like a 3-circle version of the Olympic sign.
And
that makes sense?
Yes, and it's the Eye of Elena symbol, the one of 2 circles within a larger circle. That is the same as Manon and their witch symbols. So yes, they are very slightly different. Okay, yep.
So maybe like these 3 circles, like this Arcasian amulet symbol is like an evolved version of the Eye of Elena, possibly, if Tog is in a past timeline, but we're not touching that right now because we have way too much. Let's talk about Thanatos, because oh my god, I have been waiting to talk about this since we started ACOTAR. As Kier is leaving the council chamber, he says, quote, Lord Thanatos is having difficulties with his daughter again. He requires my assistance. And then he leaves. I'm screaming because I was on TikTok one day and I saw a video by Shannon Taylor. Yes, we will link it in the show notes. Because Thanatos probably sounds mighty familiar, since he is the Prince of the Ravine, aka one of the princes of hell in Crescent City. He also, in Greek mythology, is known as the personification of death and is the son of Nyx, the goddess of night. But who is his daughter, you ask? Her name is Enris. Okay, things are looking fine so far. But until you look up, what does Enris mean? Are you ready for this, Lexi?
I'm ready.
Enris means fury. Fury! We know from House of Sky and Breath that Danica used her bloodhound tracing powers on Fury to learn what Fury's lineage was, and it was big hush hush. They like had a secret on each other, yada yada yada. Is Fury the daughter of the Prince of the 4th level of hell? And Sarah J. Maas just happened to drop it in a different series? For reference, ACOWAR came out in May 2017 and CC1 came out in March 2020. But she started writing CC1 in 2018. So it would have been very close. I am convinced that Fury is the Prince of the Ravine's daughter.
Now, to be clear, though, when they're talking about this Lord in the Court of Nightmares, it is not, or it is that same Prince of Hell.
It is Lord Thanatos, which is the same name as the Prince of the Ravine it's Thanatos in Crescent City. It is the exact same name.
But are you saying that it's the exact same person or it's a hint to it?
If they have the same name, I would have to say same person. Now, how does Kier have access to the 4th level of hell? I don't know, but maybe.
It's crazy.
Now, this also would mean if Thanatos is indeed Fury's father, that means that Thanatos had is kind of a stretch, but created, I'll say, both Fury and Hunt, which
That's
means
right,
they're kind of
Hunt's
siblings
father.
in some way.
Oh, man.
This is brilliant if this is actually accurate. Like, I'm stunned. All right, I have one more Mass vs. Madness thing. Because in the scene with the Bone Carver, he mentions multiple times wind and its connections to Nesta. He says, quote, how the wind moans her name, and, quote, I can smell the wind on you, talking to Cassian. Could this be a witch clue for the Archeron family? I know we spent a whole long time going through how they're Fae descendants and the descendant of the Fae warrior and yada yada. So we're just going to, again, put that off to the side for a moment and wonder if this is actually a clue for Mama Archeron being connected to witches. Because in Throne of Glass, witches are often called to the wind. There's so many mentions of Tog, witches, and wind. So could this be a hint, especially since Nesta several times jokes about being a witch with the Illyrians, and that scares the shit out of him. The more and more we do these kinds of theories, the more I think SJM actually might have put like multiple Easter eggs in, and then she could just decide later which bloodline she wants to go down. But I mean, it could be both. Maybe the Fae line is actually through Papa Archeron. And again, that's how he has access to Adriata and Valaris. And then maybe the witch bloodline is actually through Marma Archeron. I don't know, but it made my head go scratch.